I would rather see America on her knees before her God than I would on her knees before her enemies. It's about time that we began to rub our noses and rub everyone else's noses in the meaning of America. And that includes the pornographers and the purveyors of filth. It's just about time we quit being the so-called silent, uninvolved, detached majority, quietly letting the problems and the rest of the world go by. It's time we got active and we rolled up our sleeves and we did something about it. You know, Jesus Christ was so jealous of that temple, he cast the money changers out. It's time we weren't afraid to carry a Bible openly on the streets. Time we weren't afraid to read it. It's time we quit shuffling our feet in embarrassment, looking down whether to close our eyes when somebody gives the invocation. And it's time invocations were not poetry and speeches, and were genuine pleas to God to save this country of ours as well. I want to quote something that a great president of this country said years ago, and if it was so true then, how much truer is it today? It is a proclamation from Abraham Lincoln. April the 30th, 1863. He said, and I quote, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no nation has ever grown before. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace, and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceivableness of our own hearts that all these blessings were somehow produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with broken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity for redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended power, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness." Then that president set aside a national day of prayer and fasting. With those words, on June the 20th, 1970, Garner Ted Armstrong closed the first night of the first America Listen campaign in Nashville, Tennessee. Let us come forward 45 years to today. Has America listened? No. Will they? I don't know. What shall we tell America today? The same warning message as before. Turn with me to Revelation chapter 6 and verse 1. We're going to pick up a story. We're going to pick up the end time. When Revelation chapter 6 and verse 1 it says, "Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying, as with a voice of thunder, 'Come, see.'" These words, penned by the great Apostle John nearly 2,000 years ago, introduce one of the most terrifying stories ever told. You're familiar with it. It's the story of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It's the tale of a world that's just spinning out of control, of civilization in its death throes, of mankind pushed to the brink of extinction, of the end of days. It was never meant to simply be an entertaining story for the masses. It was offered to mankind as a grim prophecy of terrifying things to come. It is an appeal to those who heed the prophecy and entreaty to prepare for this great day of reckoning. It is a cautionary tale of a great unraveling. And it is also a lamentation for the majority who will fail to listen and who are destined to pay the ultimate price. Today, some say that this great 2,000-year-old prophecy is being fulfilled before our very eyes. That's us. That each day's headlines are filled with news of this great unraveling. Are we right? Are we right? Are they right? The few that do say it. Are we witnessing the beginning of the end? Or are the similarities between the chaos described by the Apostle John in about 96 A.D. and the turmoil being chronicled in the news of June the 13th, 2015, just mere coincidence? Well, in this message, we will examine these similarities in detail. We will see how John's catastrophic vision fits the world we see around us as never before. These prophecies about crisis we now face are both graphic and alarming because the plain truth is each of these crises represents a calamity that has already begun. The consequences are no longer avoidable. They are as certain as tomorrow's sunrise. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures say as with a voice of thunder, "Come see." Verse 2, I looked. So John looked and he wrote. I looked, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Revelation 6, 1 and 2. Today, 2015, our day, our generation, we are seeing the forces of two religions come together, which will ultimately divide the world between Western Christianity and Islam. Islam is attempting to force its ungodly and perverted teachings and way of life with the edge of the sword. It is swallowing vast swaths of land and people in its bloody trail to conquer all nations and bring humanity under the sway of its false god, Allah. Western Christianity, led by Pope Francis, is making great strides in just these Protestant denominations, bringing them right back into the fold and control of the Roman Catholic Church. Evangelical leaders are pledging their support and leadership and submission and allegiance to the great horror of Revelation in ever-increasing numbers. And there is one thing that you and I can be sure of from our personal experience within the very church of God itself. When upheaval comes, people will do what their church leaders tell them to do, regardless whether or not it is an abomination to Almighty God. You are the remnant that did not. The rest did. And look at them. With the barriers now of birth control, abortion, same-sex marriage, homosexuality, LBGT, and church ceremonies broken down. After all, you can go to the traditional Mass, or you can come at another time for the modern Mass. Or as Mark said, you can go up. We have one on the hill up near Rockland Church. There's one big mega church up on the hill up there. You can go up there, and I mean to tell you, baby, you can rock out. It is smoke, it is mirrors, it is lie, it is fantasy, but it tickles people and it salves their conscience. And that is what is happening with those broken down. Soon and very soon, America will wake up and find that all churches, except mosques, will cast off their denominational names and simply be called Catholic. or universal. We've seen many of the churches in our area change their names. Seventh-day Adventist Church has changed its name to one that goes around to a whole lot of churches being named this way. In Matthew chapter 24 verse 5, Jesus said, "For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." Sadly, America is not listening. Revelation chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. I heard the living creature saying, "Come." And a red horse went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. On September the 13th, 2014, less than 1 year ago now, Pope Francis announced that World War III has already begun. Speaking at Italy's largest war memorial, the so-called Holy Father said the spate of conflicts around the globe today is a third world war. I quote, "Each of these crises represents a calamity that has already begun. The consequences are no longer avoidable. They are as certain as tomorrow's sunrise. Humanity needs to weep, and this is the time to weep," the Pope said. The Pope has ample reason to worry and weep today and pray. ISIS is sweeping across the Middle East, as you know, bent on destroying Israel and transforming the entire region into a massive Islamic state. Iran's efforts to build nuclear weapons continue unabated despite the pathetic, embarrassing, ridiculous, and ludicrous efforts of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and the Barack Obama administration. North Korea already has nuclear weapons and has long been plotting the most effective ways to use them against the West. Japan and China are squaring off against each other, each side's eager to settle old grudges as well as modern territorial disputes down in the oil-rich China Sea. China's even building islands out of nothing. I'm just dredging up some coral and dirt and mud and making an island and claiming that's our territory, so now we've got an air base we can fly closer. It's dangerous and getting more all the time. But Russia has given the Pope more reasons to weep than all these other nations put together. Do you remember Mitt Romney saying in the last presidential debate that Russia was America's greatest threat? You remember that? He said Russia is the greatest threat to America. What was the reaction? Oh, he was derided, laughed at, scorned. In fact, Russian chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov recently claimed that Russian strongman Vladimir Putin is a greater threat to the United States than ISIS or 1,000 al-Qaeda terrorist groups. In 2014, last year, Mr. Putin blatantly, publicly, and unapologetically violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which prohibits Russia from possessing missiles that could be used as targets against Europe. Worse, while Barack Obama continues to disarm America, Putin has made no secret that his goal is to have his nuclear stockpile surpass that of these United States. In truth, it has already happened. In 2012, the U.S. had 1,722 nuclear weapons deployed. Russia had just 1,499. As of 2014, a year ago, Obama had cut our stockpiles to 1,642. Russia's had grown to 1,643. America is no longer the world's greatest nuclear power. Russia's stockpile now exceeds our own. And the disparity is about to become much larger. Last August at a conference in Yalta, Putin bragged that he would soon, and I quote, surprise the West with our new developments in offensive nuclear weapons about which we do not talk yet, end quote. Notice that he said offensive weapons. Those are first strike weapons. And notice that he said nuclear weapons. Weapons with the power to vaporize entire cities and everyone residing therein. It is likely not an empty boast. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Russia dedicates 1/3 of its defense budget to building nuclear weapons. Russia is clearly girding for war. Recently, NATO commanders revealed that Moscow has already executed several simulated nuclear attacks on Western Europe and the United States. Last September, for instance, less than a year ago, the forces responsible for Russia's strategic nuclear arsenal conducted major exercises involving more than 4,000 soldiers, 400 technical units, and substantial use of Soviet air power. The threat of World War III is real, and it is growing. Russia's nuclear bombers, fighter jets, and submarines are violating the sovereign territory of Western European nations with mounting frequency. Beginning last October, NATO officials complained that an increasingly large number of Russian military aircraft have been tracked flying unannounced in the European airspace, behavior that could easily trigger an armed response leading to war. On a single day, one single day, NATO monitored 4 groups of Russian military aircraft as they conducted significant military maneuvers in European airspace over the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Atlantic Ocean. In April, 2 Tupolev 95 bombers actually entered Dutch airspace while on an exercise. The Atlantic Council reports that NATO has had to intercept more than 100 Russian aircraft that were violating other nations' airspace in 2014. That's 400% more incursions than the previous year. And Putin's Russia is not content to limit its threats to Europe alone. In September, U.S. fighters intercepted 2 Russian MiG-31 fighter jets, 2 Russian Bear long-range nuclear bombers, and 2 refueling aircraft as they entered the U.S. air identification zone near Alaska. A few hours later, Canadian CF-18 fighter jets intercepted 2 more Russian bombers within 40 miles of the Canadian coastline. If it all isn't frightening enough, Russia has now become a formidable combatant in the 21st century's primary battleground, cyber warfare. And since this was put in the sleeves here, we find out they have all our military personnel. All the records of all our military has been hacked. Incredible. In the fall of 2012, then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta warned that the U.S. would someday face a cyber Pearl Harbor at the hands of a Russia with advanced cyber capabilities. Now that Pearl Harbor could occur at any moment without notice, because Vladimir Putin now has the power to end American life as we know it with the mere push of a button. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? His weapon, a destructive Trojan horse computer program called Black Energy. Have you heard of it? Black Energy? It was created by Dragonfly. It's a group of sophisticated hackers sponsored by the Russian government. Black Energy gives Russian technicians the power to shut down the U.S. electrical grid, oil and gas pipelines, water distribution systems, our nuclear plants, and more. And they can do it all by simply pressing a button on any computer, an iPad, or even a smartphone. The worst news? The Pentagon admits that it has absolutely no defense against black energy. We are quite literally at Vladimir Putin's mercy. He can quite literally switch off America's power grid, water supply, and energy pipelines with the touch of a button. Imagine how your life would change without electricity, fuel, or water. Imagine that for a moment. Your bank and ATM closed. The stores where you buy food and gasoline shut down. The flow of electricity, water, and natural gas to your home halted. Imagine the chaos, the panic, the desperation. Imagine the demonstrations, the riots, the looting, as hundreds of millions of people, desperate people, many of them armed to the teeth, take to the streets in search of food and water. Imagine the impact on the government's ability to protect your family from marauding gangs of hungry looters. Hey, they can't even do it now in a pool party going crazy, much less that. Not to mention the threat of foreign attack. Imagine the catastrophic impact on the economy. Vladimir Putin can now make that nightmare a reality right here in America at any time with a touch of a button. Maybe some of you, like Charlotte and I, perhaps watch Fox News. Maybe a lot of you do. If you do, then you know that Judge Jeanine Pirro and Greta Van Susteren of Fox News have been sounding this alarm for at least the past 2 years. Don't know if anything's been done about it yet. Doesn't seem like it. And there are still more threats to consider as political radicals inside the United States work to create 1,000 Fergusons, 1,000 Baltimores from coast to coast. And they're doing a good job, aren't they? As Islamic terrorists intensify their attacks on us at work, on the streets, and at home. Has anyone forgotten the beheading of a lady in Oklahoma? Anyone forgotten the hatchet attack of the policeman in New York where the other partner had to shoot him dead? These things come and go, and they seem to get buried somewhere along the way, but they're increasing more and more. How about the gang that just stormed the police station in New York? Dallas, Texas. Dallas, Texas? You've got to be kidding. This is where it's happening. One of the many places. Civil unrest, rioting, looting, arson on the rise across America, with these domestic terrorists striking us with ever-increasing frequency, and with the threats now posed by Russia. Sadly, America is not listening. Revelation chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice saying, A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. You realize how scary that is? This is the black horse of disease and starvation. Most Americans think that great plagues can only happen back in medieval times, in the Middle Ages. That was before we understood how germs spread, before we really learned the importance of sanitization and personal hygiene in all of our areas, various activities of life, from home to hospitals and so on. That is not the case. Less than 100 years ago, the influenza, don't we call that flu? I've been calling it flu forever, that I know of, ever since I was a kid. And I've had it used to have it every year. But that's what we called it. We had a flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919 that killed more people than World War I. About 40 million men, women, and children around the world lost their lives to what they called the Blue Death. You turn blue from lack of oxygen. It was the single most devastating epidemic in recorded history. And let's bring it home. It infected 28% of all Americans and killed 675,000 people in these United States. More than were killed in America's deadliest war, which was the Civil War. The victim stories are heartbreaking. I did pull out some quotes from survivors to let you know how bad this is going to get. One night, 3 of my friends and I got together to play bridge. The next morning, all 3 of my friends had died from influenza. It was terrifying. Several of my fellow employees began feeling sick on their way to work. They were dead within hours. There were so many dead, there was no time to bury them. Caskets stacked up in garages. So many grave diggers fell to the disease that families had to dig their own relatives' graves. I remember that schools, government offices, and businesses were shut down to fight the infection. There, quote, there was a feeling we could not even turn to God because it was illegal to congregate in a church, in a crowd. Couldn't even go to church to pray. If you're still tempted to think such an epidemic couldn't happen today, please, my dear brethren, think again. The World Health Organization says the risk of a global bird flu pandemic has never been higher. Its annual World Health Report warns that the threat of a pandemic of influenza from this virus is still not a matter of if, but when. And the Washington Post says, more likely than not, over the course of this century, we will face an influenza pandemic similar to the one in 1918 that killed an estimated 50 million people. But the plain truth is, the world's next epidemic of infectious disease has already begun. It is already here in the United States, in our state, in your state, in our city, in your city, maybe, God forbid, in your workplace or even in your home. The Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, calls it public health's ticking time bomb. The White House has warned that it is spreading rapidly across the country and around the world. British Prime Minister David Cameron warns that the world will be cast back into the dark ages of medicine unless action is immediately taken. The World Health Organization says it is a far greater threat than Ebola, SARS, enterovirus, or any of the other infectious diseases the popular media obsesses about today. What are they talking about? They're talking about MRSA. Are you familiar with MRSA? M-R-S-A. MRSA is a staph infection. You know what you get when you go to the hospital. Surgeries, doctor's offices. A staph infection defies most, and in some cases, all modern antibiotics. About 2 million Americans are infected by MRSA every year. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 450,000 of them are hospitalized because even when treated promptly, MRSA infection can be a death sentence. Of more than 75,000 MRSA infections treated at VA hospitals in 2012, 3 years ago, nearly 10,000 proved fatal. Hospitals are so alarmed by the spread of this dreaded infection that many are now setting aside entire floors solely for the treatment of patients with MRSA. We have one of our dear brethren that lives in Phoenix, a gentleman who had back surgery some years back because of a work accident. And guess what he got in the surgery room? MRSA. Today he is in constant pain, walks with a cane, and it just absolutely, it's just terrible. It's one of our brethren. Now, I put out a prayer request some time ago for a gentleman named Fred in our Rockland church. Thank you for your prayers for him. He went in for a routine lower back laminectomy, a simple operation. Because of a doctor's mistake, he is a paraplegic and is on dialysis 3 days a week, permanently, unless God's grace intervenes. And you know what he got in the hospital? Well, when I went to see him in the hospital, to go into his room, you had to stop and you had to gown up and glove up and mask up and everything. Because on his board, whiteboard where they put the instructions, MRSA. He had it. They infused massive amounts of antibiotics in him. And they actually controlled it. They actually got it under control with him. Thank God for that. But now he's in a rehabilitation center, trying to deal with the problems that he has. But this MRSA is deadly. They told me, don't you touch his bed, touch him, touch his sheets, his linens, nothing. You stand where you are and talk to him, and then you leave. So that's what we did. The worst news of all is that this global MRSA epidemic is only the beginning. According to a recent White House statement on the danger posed by MRSA and other drug-resistant bacteria, here's the quote. If the effectiveness of antibiotics is lost, we will no longer be able to reliably and rapidly treat bacterial infections, including bacterial pneumonias, foodborne illnesses, and healthcare-associated infections. You know what a healthcare-associated infection is? Bed sore. That's the most common thing in the nursing homes, a bed sore. As more strains of bacteria become resistant to an ever larger number of antibiotics, our drug choices have become increasingly limited and more expensive, and in some cases, non-existent. A staph infection. To end their quote, in a world with few effective antibiotics, modern medical advances such as surgery, transplants, and chemotherapy may no longer be viable due to the threat of this infection. A simple cut of the finger could lead to a life-threatening infection. Common surgical procedures such as hip and knee replacements would be far riskier because of the danger of infection. Dialysis patients could develop untreatable bloodstream infections. Life-saving treatments to suppress immune systems, such as chemotherapy and organ transplants, could potentially cause more harm than good. This is why the World Health Organization, or WHO, is calling MRSA, quote, a problem so serious that it threatens the achievements of modern medicine. A post-antibiotic era in which common infections and minor injuries can kill. Far from being an apocalyptic fantasy, is instead a very real possibility for the 21st century, end of the quote. But even this nightmarish vision of the immediate future falls short of the worst-case scenario, and that is the truly terrifying possibility of the rise of a global pandemic flu or some other infection that defies modern antibiotics altogether. At the time when the global population was only 1.5 billion, in 1918, that flu pandemic killed upwards of 50 million people. Today, with a world population of over 7 billion, a pandemic of drug-resistant flu could take upwards of 200 million lives. Needless to say, such a catastrophe will have a devastating impact on everybody, including those who are able to avoid the infection. John wrote and says that the price of grain is 1 denarius, about 10 times its normal price, when he penned those words in the book of Revelation in the 1st century. At those prices, each worker would have to work full time just to feed himself. It would not be enough to share with his family. The entire family would go to bed hungry. For those of us who live in the developed world, it's hard to imagine being truly, really hungry, isn't it? Let alone standing by helplessly as our children or grandchildren go to bed with empty stomachs. In truth, we have witnessed soaring food prices and starvation often in modern times, both in the third world and also in the developed nations. We've seen it happen repeatedly early in the 20th century. And we'll start back in 1921, and we'll come forward. Remember, this is the red horse. In 1921 Poland, food prices doubled every 19 days. In 1923 Germany, they doubled every 4 days. In 1944 Greece, they doubled every 4 days. In 1946 Hungary, food prices doubled every 15 hours. We've also seen government-engineered famines more recently. In 1982 Mexico, the inflation rate hit 10,000%, driving the price of food up 100 times in 12 months. In 1989 Argentina, the peso was devalued 3 times, driving food prices up 3,079% in a single year. In 1994 Brazil, inflation raised at 2,076% per year, making food more than 20 times more expensive than the year before. Plus, in 1994 Yugoslavia, food prices doubled every 34 hours. And in 2008 Zimbabwe, they doubled every single day. Of course, the best documented hyperinflationary episode in history is the one that nearly destroyed the great German people between 1922 and 1923. See if there is any correlation to 22 and 23 to 2009 through now. The German government began printing unbacked paper marks. First to finance World War I and later to pay war reparations. By late 1923, 300 paper mills and 2,000 printing presses worked around the clock cranking out German marks, banknotes. The human toll was devastating. On average, prices doubled every 3 days. Now, ladies, I want you to listen to this, if you would. You're the ones usually have to go to the grocery store. In a single month, prices exploded more than 32,000% in Germany because they printed unbacked money, paper money, phony fiat money. Sound familiar? Think about how that would feel, ladies. In April, you paid $4 for a gallon of milk. By May, the price is nearly $1,300 for a gallon of milk. A loaf of bread that cost you $2.40 today in July the 13th, on July the 13th, would cost you $768 for a loaf of bread. That's hyperinflation. It happened. Why did it happen? For the same reason it's going to happen again. The survivor stories are terrifying. When I reached the store, a full pound of sugar on the shelf was 2 million marks. By the time I reached the cashier, it had doubled. I had no choice. Instead of buying a full pound, I could only afford half a pound. Items that could be purchased for 1 mark at the end of the war cost 726 billion marks by 1923. Everybody's got their 401k and their retirement and their Charles Schwab and Wells Fargo wealth management. Millions of citizens found that their life's savings would not even buy a postage stamp. Winston Churchill said, "The further you look back in history, the further you can look into the future." Because history repeats itself. Look in the future, brethren. Look back a little ways and look in the future. Right here in good old red and white and blue USA. Faced with certain starvation, ordinary citizens turned to crime. Looting and robbery ran rampant. Rioters destroyed hundreds of stores, and martial laws imposed across the nation. What happens when a hurricane threatens? Store shelves get empty, don't they? A lot of jostling and carrying on, a few fist fights. Wait till there's nothing. As Germany's birth rate fell and the infant death rate rose, the suicide rate also skyrocketed. Germany's encounter with runaway inflation was called an economic massacre. But that was the daily reality in Germany in 1923. Desperation, starvation, death. Here's the point. There, in Germany, there had been no drought. There were no plagues of locusts devouring farmers' crops. The entire crisis was man-made by its government and banking system. The nation's leaders made it by creating unbacked paper marks out of thin air. So what does that have to do with you here today, in today's world? Quite simply, everything. Germany sank into the most severe hyperinflationary period in recorded history after printing 1.3 trillion marks. Ironically, the U.S. government has printed 3.6 trillion paper dollars since 2008. That's 3.6 trillion. That's the tip of the iceberg. The European Union has printed 503 billion euros. Japan has printed 180 trillion yen. That's 1.5 trillion. The United Kingdom has printed 314 billion pounds. That's 493 billion. Altogether, that's well over $6 trillion of worthless notes running around the world. Because this time it's not isolated to one country called Germany. We're a global economy, all tied together. When this horse, it's already started to ride, believe me. You will see its effects very, very soon in America. It's coming. You see, they said, when we sent our goods and sold them to the Europeans during World War I, before we got into the war, we were only there about the last 6 months. We sold them our goods, and so on and so forth. They paid us in gold. We put it in the vault. World War II did the same thing. That's why we had 90% of the world's gold. Why we became the gold standard. The dollar is as good as gold. Remember that? What's it good as now? It's kind of rolled up next to you know what? In your house. In a certain room. It's good for nothing. The problem, they said that America has exported its inflation. The thing is, the powers of the world, the central banks of other countries, have gotten onto this ruse and bluff we've had now, and they're sending the dollars back. They're sending them back. And what's now a trickle is going to become a flood. And what's going to happen? We're going to have our food prices are already rising rapidly. Any ladies been to the grocery store lately? Are food prices on the rise in Texas? Whew. Flour prices are up 19%, ice cream up 21%. Rice and cheddar cheese, 27%. Chicken is up 34%. Orange is 70%. Hamburger meat is a whopping 74%. Worse, health care costs are up a staggering 22.5%. It's going, starting. It's only beginning. Because when that trickle of newly printed money flows back into this economy and is fast becoming a flood, as the rest of it hits food prices, they can explode higher with no end in sight. You know what caused the Arab Spring in Egypt and these countries? It was food prices. Check your history. That's what caused the riots and the overthrow of governments in those countries. Food prices. Once you reach 40% of your income for food, you're in trouble. They reached over 43% and went on up from there. Look at our prices. We've said it for all these years. Sadly, America is not listening. Brethren, it's important to understand what the Apostle John says about the impact of the first three horsemen, the war, a great plague and starvation from soaring food prices. He sums up the terrifying consequences in his description of the fourth and final horseman of the apocalypse. Revelation chapter 6, verse 7 and 8. When the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence. There's no doubt that food prices are soaring, or that they're likely to explode even higher as a $6 trillion tidal wave of newly printed money crashes into this economy. There's no doubt that a MRSA epidemic has already begun, and that the World Health Organization is correct when it says that MRSA is a problem so serious that it threatens the achievements of all modern medicine. There's no doubt that Russia's Vladimir Putin is arming himself to the teeth, threatening to embroil the war in a great nuclear war. There's no doubt we are experiencing a rapidly rising tide of violence right here in the United States due to the rising rates of violent crime, civil unrest, and terrorism. But still, many people find this final prophecy difficult to accept. Does John mean the death toll of these crises could really mount up to 25% of humanity? Or is he saying that war, disease, and starvation will bring to death to 1/4 of all the nations on earth? The one thing that we can be sure of is that this fourth prophecy is meant to be a grave warning to anybody who might be tempted to take these other prophecies lightly. The message here is very clear. The consequences of knowing or ignoring these prophecies could not be more serious. At the very least, one of them is enough to spell the death of the world as we know it. The death of our way of life. Combined, they represent a global catastrophe of epic proportions, or as they say, of biblical proportions. As we've seen, these are not merely 2,000-year-old predictions, they're present-day fact. We are already seeing the religions of the world being formed into two competing entities, both with a false God and a false Messiah. We're already seeing a terrifying increase in violence around the globe, from Russian threats of nuclear catastrophe to ISIS threats to bring the West to its knees, even to eradicate in the U.S. burning American cities to the ground. We're already seeing the MRSA pandemic spreading like wildfire across the land. 2 million new infections each year in this United States alone. 500,000 hospitalizations, soaring death rates. Now MRSA infections are threatening to wipe out 2,000 years of all medical advances, turning surgery and other life-giving procedures into virtual death sentences, bringing our entire healthcare system to its knees. And beyond MRSA, a rose gallery of infectious diseases is only one tiny mutation away from wreaking havoc on all mankind. We are already seeing soaring food prices right here in the United States, and those on fixed incomes are finding it very difficult to survive. But the full impact of the unbacked paper dollars the Fed has created out of thin air is still to be felt. The vast majority of that money is still sitting on bank balance sheets, and all they are is digits, computer digits. It's only begun to trickle into the economy, but soon that trickle has become a flood and driving food prices so higher relentlessly we won't know what hit us. The sad truth is this, that the Bible, the Apostle John, and the prophecy all say that most of humanity will fail to heed these warnings and will pay the price. Instead of seeing the coming storm and preparing, they will say, "We're at peace. My family and I are safe. Why should I worry?" The answer is in the Apostle Paul's words. It can be found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 3. "For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them. as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. My brethren, this is the calm before the storm. This is the time to fulfill our commission as the watchman, and as best we can, however we can, with whatever we are available and whatever means God gives us, warn our communities and our nation what lies in store only a very short time ahead. 45 years later, it is up to us to say, America, listen, before it's too late.